What are you doing?
critical
Taking
thinking.
pictures?
No, we record.
You record
Video and audio.
and video?
Audio, video, AV.
First question from me. Who has read Hannah Arendt's introduction to Benjamin in Illuminations? You have.
I dashed through it.
You dashed through it.
Yes. Just to get an idea of who this guy
Is
is.
it the case that most of you do not read introductions to texts,
I don't until after I read.
but after you read?
Yeah.
So
Now, the
you-
other way with Marcuse, I read the epilogue first.
Uh-huh.
I'll go backwards. But
No way.
the introductions and prefaces, especially with novels, a lot of times they give away what happens and direct my thinking, so.
Well, I think in the case of nonfiction, political and social and philosophical analysis, it's always good to read an introduction, even if it's not by the author.
But it's still gonna direct my thinking rather than, I'd rather read first and then go and then read again. That's how. Tabula rasa, I just like to walk in blind.
Tabula rasa.
Yeah.
We have a follower of John Locke
That's right.
sitting here among us. I always read the prefaces and the introductions. Sometimes after I've read a good piece of the text, and sometimes at the beginning. Hannah Arendt's introduction is very useful. If you read it, you will learn something about Benjamin's life. Not that she's written a biography in 50 pages or 30 pages, but she has highlighted some features of his life and of the life of people like him that are relatively important. One of the most interesting parts of that introduction that I found is the contempt that she has, stated, if not over and over again, at least it's a theme throughout the introduction to Benjamin, of people who are rich and take on the burdens of the poor. Well, they do it from 2 points of view. One is the point of view of being rich and George Soros and helping the poor. And the other is sometimes, when they stay rich themselves, giving up all of their belongings from inheritance usually, and going out of, and she thinks that that's the only genuinely authentic way of thinking about rich people who become concerned with the poor. If you're concerned with the poor, become poor, which is what Benjamin did. His family wasn't rich, but they were rich enough. What's interesting about Benjamin, in this respect, is that he was still hoping to get some kind of subsidy from his father. His father gave him a small monthly income, but did not give him enough to live comfortably. Benjamin wanted to be according to Arendt, wanted to be a scholar without credentials, because he was denied credentials by the German Academy. but he never got them. But there's something else about the Arendt introduction that you will find interesting after what I'm about to tell you, I think. Her introduction is very illuminating in many respects, but there's one thing that is missing. The Institute for Social Research, in any detail, and especially their relationship to Benjamin, whom they subsidized to a very small degree. But she acts as if he had no subsidy at all from anybody but his father. And Michael reminds me that she didn't like the Institute at all. And that may account for her omission. But I'm just supplying this because it's important to understand as you're reading Benjamin that he was not entirely dependent upon his family, who basically denied him a good living. He did have some other sources which were, however, sporadic.
What was her problem with the Institute?
She had no problem with the Institute except that she didn't like them. And she really didn't mention the relationship to him. It is as if they didn't exist. Which is like my father would say, hooey.
She found them to be very spoiled, very well off, sons of Jewish merchants and industrialists who really didn't have a connection to the world.
Yes.
Like she did, and in a way you have to remember she was very much on the front lines after the war, with Jewish migration and very involved in this, and of course was ostracized by the Jewish community during the Eichmann in Jerusalem phase.
Yeah.
People would not talk to her. In fact, there's a famous story about Irving Howe going up to her 2 years after they had gone after her at a party, and he went up and apologized to Arendt about how she had been scapegoated and treated. She used to smoke Pall Mall cigarettes. I don't know if you know Pall Mall. They're very long and they have long ashes.
She smoked
She took her cigarette and
cigarettes.
flipped it on his jacket and then walked away.
What was their
So-
complaint with her in terms of?
Well, the complaint is that she said that Eichmann was
Banality
only
of evil.
following orders
Yeah,
and
banality of
was,
evil.
the banality of evil, was a concept that was used, and and she was sent there by the New Yorker to be a reporter. So, I mean, it's interesting, you have these kind of conflicts too, and also, there was an ongoing, Arendt never really gave up on Heidegger, remained in contact throughout, whereas Marcuse in 48 broke finally. Adorno never had a relationship with Heidegger, and, in some ways she was very different, in terms of that group, incredibly intelligent, and maybe you could say she's an original philosopher in her own right. But a very different take. And
Well, yeah,
So anyway, I don't,
Marcuse's break is understandable because he was Heidegger's assistant and wrote a book on Hegel from a Heideggerian perspective, which I have read, which is in English. It's called Hegel's Ontology. To give Hegel an ontological label is a very radical and unorthodox move. And the early Marcuse did that. And I don't think that the Institute, although he was part of it, ever forgave him for that book and his relationship to Heidegger. There's a book written by Richard Wallen, which is called Heidegger's Children, and Marcuse is one of 4. Arendt is another one. She was a student of Heidegger's as well. What is this guy's name who wrote,
Carl Loveth.
huh?
Carl Loveth.
What?
Carl Loveth.
Levitt,
Yeah.
yeah. Levitt, who wrote a book called From Hegel to Nietzsche,
Nietzsche.
which is a very good book. And I'm trying to remember who the fourth one was. You remember who the fourth one was?
I'm probably Hans Jonas.
Jonas, that's
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
exactly right. Hans Jonas, Jonas, was a refugee who came to the United States and taught at the New School and wrote a very good book on politics. And his field was Gnosticism, which he has a book on Gnosticism as well. His book on Hegel and his legacy was quite controversial when it came out because Nietzsche was no icon, no hero to the left. Jonas was a person of the left. Please read the introduction, because although she identifies herself as a non-Marxist, the introduction indicates that she was a thoroughgoing materialist, not an idealist in a philosophical terms. Everybody knows what idealism is now, don't we? You know what idealism is? Oh, come on. You know what idealism is, Mike?
Well, I take idealism to mean that ideas create historical experience, as opposed to materialism, which would say experience creates ideas.
Yeah, well, materialism always refers to what Marcuse called the reality principle, but the actual reality. And idealism, Kant, and many others, who had a lot of good ideas, particularly dialectical ideas, still believed that thought created reality in a way. And that was something that you had to break with if you were going to follow the materialist dialectic, which Marcuse did. And I believe Arendt has a very strong trace of it. From this introduction alone, Origins of Totalitarianism doesn't deal with the philosophical issue at all. This does. Well, if this continues to make me a hero in your regard, keep it up. It's not true.
You want another one, Stanley? You want another one?
No,
Okay.
no,
I'm just
no.
wondering if the kick is good enough.
We are going to embark today on a project which we might not finish today. In fact, if we finish today, it will have turned out to be fairly superficial. We're going to do a close reading of a thesis on the philosophy of history.
Right.
And a close reading entails, in my opinion, different versions of reading closely out loud, literally, and then before we go on, having a discussion of each thesis. I have taught classes. I've never been in a class, by the way, as a student. I've taught classes. Oh, yes, I did. Yeah, I remember now. Yeah, no, I did. Yeah. That was when I tried to be a graduate student at the New School. And I couldn't stomach it. I really couldn't.
Well, you sat at the Jefferson School. That was before university.
That was when I was a teenager.
I hear you, Stan.
Let me pull it up.
I read Hegel's Phenomenology and I read Marx's
Yeah.
Volume 1 at the age of 16 and 17. And I don't know I learned anything. Well, Marx's Volume 1 I learned. Hegel I probably didn't learn because when I read it again 20 years later, it was all new. It may have been that I learned something from Hegel, maybe the most elementary conception of the dialectic, but I really knew something beyond that, beyond being a 16-year-old. I learned more. I'm not saying I was smarter, I just learned more. Because I was learning under the aegis of the communist school called Jefferson School.
Can I mention something about the Arendt introduction just for a second,
Of
in terms
course.
of Benjamin? I mean, one of the things that really struck me is her description of him. He was not a scholar, a philologist, a translator, a theologian, a poet, or a philosopher. He was kind of one of his own kind. He was very generous. She kept mentioning that, throughout, in a way. And his greatest ambition was to build a book completely of quotations. Yeah, not just really, this was his greatest ambition. His other great ambition was to be the premier German literary critic. That was his other ambition.
I think he succeeded.
Yes, he succeeded in maybe one
In the
of
second
those.
ambition.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, this is something that really struck.
Arendt does
Yeah,
not
yeah.
focus on his literary work except in certain chapters. The Baudelaire chapter, Epic Theater, and the Kafka chapters. The storyteller chapter is really not about, it's not a literary chapter. So, but he wanted to be a literary critic because he thought in some ways that you could discover more about reality through literature than you could about from history, from the discipline of history or philosophy or any other specialized discipline. So let's turn to...
I don't want to deflect. Could I just ask one question about just these thinkers
Yeah.
in general? What is it with their OSS connections? How come they were...
Well, Benjamin was not OSS.
No, but
He didn't
the
make
other-
it to,
the other
to that long.
two-
Marcuse was OSS.
Norman O'Brien. In fact,
Norman O'Brien was a classicist
Right.
who became a reader,
yeah.
like Marcuse, in the Office of Strategic Services.
His first book is Hermes the Thief, which really anticipated much of the nuclear, codes. It's called Hermes the Thief.
So what is the connection between that and their
Very
later
interesting.
development? I mean, okay, they started out there and then became is that the trajectory of their careers? Did they start out with the OSS and then become these critics?
No, they were brought into the OSS.
Oh,
They were academics. They were, no.
Why did they join?
Would-be academics in some respects.
Why did they join then? I mean, why would they join a reactionary organization?
It was different
Well,
then.
it was very
My father
different.
was OSS, it was not the CIA,
Yeah.
at that time.
We were guests then, not just visitors.
Yeah.
Let me do this
Yeah, sure,
for a minute,
please.
okay? Thank you.
Sure.
The Office of Strategic Services was established by a general of the United States Armed Forces to ferret out Nazi and fascist, well, it was all fascist ideology, and James Donovan. And what
Wild
he was,
Bill.
Wild Bill.
Wild Bill.
what?
Wild Bill.
Wild Bill.
Played by Robert De Niro in the movies.
So what he had as a virtue, which these bums now don't have, which is why they can be considered really contemptuously bums. People like Trump and his whole troop, what they had, that is the armed forces at the time. This is at the end of the Second World War. is they had an appreciation for who would understand A, Soviet Marxism. Marcuse wrote a book on the subject. Fascist ideology, who knew enough philosophy to be able to know anything about fascist ideology? Marcuse, Brown, and a bunch of others.
Yeah, in ancient Greek and Latin, you know, in Brown's case, it was a classicist was
Greek and
able to
Latin,
decode,
right.
you know,
And so
Nazi
he
war
hired
machine.
them to do the reading in German of Nazi ideology and anything else that they could find. Most of them could work their way through Italian because they knew Spanish and they knew French especially, and they did. That was not a first job. That, or even a first encounter with philosophy. That was a decision by the United States government under Roosevelt and Donovan, the army chief, one of the chiefs, to find out exactly what this regime was about, because they understood, as most leftists as well as liberals do not understand, that political power, economic power is closely connected to philosophy, to ideology, to literature, etc. They understood that the philosophers and the literary critics may have more to offer than the historians. They had some historians working for them, but who really made the analysis was another matter. Marcuse was a man who did not have an academic job until Brandeis hired him in academic year 1953, which is September 1953. So he spent much of the 40s working for the United States government, including the post-Second World War times. He worked for the State Department, he worked for the Office of Strategic Services, and he had a grant, a one-year grant to Columbia University's School of International Affairs, and participated with called warriors like Brzezinski. His politics never changed, but he was anti-communist party, although not anti-communist small c. And the Columbia tradition, which gets broken later on, is one that does not favor the Marxists or the communists, but does not discriminate against them to the extent that most other places, including Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, did. And so you will find on their faculty during the Cold War period, as cold as it was, the anthropologist Bernard Stone, who was a Marxist and probably a member of the Communist Party, was not purged. It was the state institutions like CUNY, the City College, Brooklyn College, Queens College, that purged the left. In New York metropolitan area and Rutgers, they were the worst.
Morris Finkelstein, he took off, huh?
Yeah.
Changed his name. Became
Morris
Moses Finley.
Finkelstein. Moses Finley. On the other hand, Julius Garfinkel,
Yeah, right.
John Garfield,
John Garfield.
decided to change his name for screen purposes. My mother was a classmate of Julius Garfinkel. and she knew that he had become John Garfield. You know, and she didn't tell any stories, but she was always amused that the Jews in Hollywood often changed their name. One of them, of course, you know the name. His name was Paul Newman. You're surprised? No. Hollywood was full of Jews.
There was Metro, there was Goldman, and there was Mayer.
The actors could not, they felt. The moguls and the actors felt that they could not use their original names of Finkelstein or
Kirk Douglas.
Garfinkel, none of that. So they changed their name, and Paul Newman stayed with his name. John Garfield died in '49.
How he died?
He never changed his name because the Cold War was still very anti-Semitic, which anti-Semitism, as you now know, never disappeared. My partner and wife, Ellen Willis, always claimed that the left never acknowledged the anti-Semitism in the country or its own anti-Semitism. She did not think that the critique of Israel was wrong, but she felt that some of it was informed by anti-Semitism. And she probably was right. This was not the Israel of Netanyahu. This was the Israel of the Israeli Labor Party, which was not any good, which wasn't any good, but it wasn't the same as Netanyahu.
Right.
I had many anti-Semitic experiences because I never changed my name when I got into the labor movement.
This is a good time to ask.
What?
That's a good time to ask something I don't know. Aronowitz, the name itself. What is the cultural background of the?
Arano?
Yeah.
He was Hungarian
No.
bourgeoisie.
Okay. So, your father was Hungarian bourgeoisie?
My father?
No, he thought you were talking about Andrew Arado.
Oh, Arano.
No, I'm talking about Aronowitz.
Aronowitz was Adonovich. And people couldn't pronounce Aronowitz, much less Adonovich. They couldn't pronounce Adonovich.
So is that Russian or Polish or?
It's Russian.
Lithuania, right?
But they came. My father's family came from Lithuania, and my mother's family came from Belarus.
All right.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.
All right, let's turn to the text.
Only reading this text and your comment about the OSS and their interest or recognition that philosophy was more important than history.
Could be more important.
Yeah,
not
could be more.
was.
Yeah, but could be more important. Certainly, what Benjamin is saying in several of these segments explains why history has its shortcomings and philosophy has a better
All right,
sense
I'm going
of.
to tell you a nice little story. It's a tiny story. There's a guy who's now retired who was a historian at Columbia University and the president of the American Historical Association and the son and nephew of 4 communist brothers. The man's name at Columbia, his name was Eric Foner. And Eric Foner was a subscriber to a journal that Jameson and I established called Social Text, which is still in business, but not still the same social text. He said to me one day when I was teaching at Columbia, he said, I subscribe to Social Text, I don't understand it, but people tell me I should subscribe. I don't understand it, said Eric Foner.
Wow.
But Eric Foner was a historian and he was not a materialist dialectical. God. He wasn't. He was a liberal historian, a very good liberal historian, until after Reconstruction he decided to become overtly liberal, and that's when he got elected the American Historical Association president. But the historians have that problem. They are trained to write and study chronologically. You find hardly any chronological dates in Benjamin's writing.
Because it's all debris.
That's
How
right.
can you date debris?
Debris, yeah.
Well, you can, but it's meaningless, right?
Yeah.
We probably could talk about the Annales School in the same breath as Benjamin, their longue durée and, a kind of very
Longue
different
durée,
approach
yeah.
to history.
Why don't you
than
talk about it?
chronological. No, I mean, the Annales School was a French group led by Marc Bloch was the theoretician who was actually killed by the Gestapo, and Ferdinand Braudel, where there's an institute at SUNY Buffalo, right? It's a
You want an exemplary
yeah.
attempt at a historian who does materialist dialectic, 2 volumes by Marc Bloch on feudalism.
Society, yeah.
That's what it's called.
Yeah.
On
Feudal society, on
Oh,
feudalism,
yeah.
feudal society. It's
Feudal
two-
society.
Two volumes.
And he wrote it before the war.
Yeah. I mean, these were major figures in French, historiographic work. Georges Dubuis, also a specialist in the medieval period, did a beautiful book called The Age of the Cathedrals, as well as a book on the medieval orders of the imaginary, 3 imaginary orders, which go back to the church's domination, and he used
But
many levels.
Braudel is widely translated into English. Bloch's 2 volumes on feudal society are translated
Right.
into English. He also has a conceptual book on history. I actually think he calls it What is History?
Bloch's book is called The Historian's Craft.
Historian's Craft,
Yeah.
right.
And Braudel wrote a book on, on understanding and
Yeah.
doing history as well, and the materialist conception of
Yeah.
history. But the interesting thing about them, it's not a traditional kind of descriptive or analytic history. It's a much longer view
Yeah.
in which, the classic work was Braudel's The Mediterranean, the Age of Philip II,
Yeah.
which was the advent of mercantile capitalism, but how he dealt with everyday life and
And
the
he
everyday life of people.
actually counted
Yeah.
material exchanges of money
Yes.
and of goods
Mm.
to show what mercantilism was about. It was a very minute kind of study he did. I think there's 6 volumes in it. Yeah.
Another beautiful book is Jacques Legoff's The Birth of Purgatory,
Yeah.
the advent of the modern banking system.
Wow.
The dawn of the
Legoff.
modern
Wow.
bank. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Legoff,
Legoff.
Legoff, yeah.
Yeah.
Jacques Legoff.
And let's get to this.
Anyway.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah.
So we'll start by reading out loud. You want to start, Matt? The first thesis.
The story is told of an automaton constructed in such a way that it could play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move. A puppet in Turkish attire and with a hookah in its mouth sat before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent from all sides. Actually, a little hunchback, who was an expert chess player, sat inside and guided the puppet's hand by means of strings. One can imagine a philosophical counterpart to this device. The puppet, called historical materialism, is to win all the time. It can easily be a match for anyone if it insists the services of a theology, which today, as we know, is wizened and has to keep out of sight.
Theology. Has anybody in this room, aside from Michael and me, read any theology?
A little bit.
St. Augustine,
What'd you read?
A little.
City of God.
Huh?
City of God.
City
Yeah,
of God.
City of God,
Yeah.
a good chunk of that.
Yeah,
Oh, God.
Thomas Aquinas.
Didn't read Aquinas.
That's an important
Martin.
book.
Yeah.
I've read some like liberal, more contemporary theology about war and peace stuff.
What's that?
I can't, like, they're not famous, like, theologians and literary types talking about how to make peace break out, things like that.
I remember a big argument that I had with somebody when somebody in a room said, "Should we believe in the following slogan, no war but the class war?" And I said, "Sounds good to me."
Yeah.
And this person said, "I'm not for that, I'm for peace." I said, we will not have peace. At that time, I was following very closely the work of Louis Althusser, a Marxist philosopher, who actually was among the first publicly to say that communism would not entail the end of conflict. That there will always be conflicts. There won't be class conflicts necessarily, but there will always be social conflicts. That basically the communists hated in this country, and the pacifists hated as well. We were going to have a world of love and understanding, and there would never be any kind of serious social conflict again. That's what they believed. And that's what they were fighting for. But this term, no war but the class war, to me was a pretty accurate description of where we were at the moment, and will be for a long time, as long at least as capitalism survives. I don't think we can have peace under capitalism. It's a warlike society and has been since its inception.
But you're not talking about conflict under capitalism. You're talking about the persistence of conflict under communism.
No, I'm not talking. I would go to conflict. I'm not sure about contradiction yet. Contradiction is irrevocable. You have to resolve the contradiction before you can move forward, because the resolution always gives rise to new elements of contradiction. This is Hegel's legacy to Marxism. No end to contradiction. Most Marxists think that there will never be contradiction under communism or socialism.
So, Stanley, can I ask, isn't the implication of what you're saying that we have other problems than capitalism?
We have other problems than capitalism is a vulgar expression. Obviously, we have other problems. The reason to study culture, the reason to study ideology, the reason to study Soviet Marxism, the reason which Marcuse studied, was to understand that you can have public ownership, you can abolish private property in the ownership of the means of production and still have serious ideology. And if you have serious ideology, which the Soviets did have, it was called Stalinism, you were going to have conflict, serious conflict.
I don't think it's an accident that Marx died with a copy of Aristotle's Prior Analytics, in which contradiction is first proposed as a moving force in the movement of the mind, and on his table,
That's right.
his reading chair. So this is kind of interesting that we go back, and in ancient Greek, that is.
But let's get back to
Can
thesis
you-
one. Yeah.
Can you help, can you help us understand this first
I want to see
thesis?
what your understanding is before I have.
Well, the puppet. So we have this debate of. So he's saying a puppet is historical materialism, and it can easily be a match for anyone if it enlists services of theology. So, but when I hear a puppet, I think of a puppet being controlled by the hunchback. So
Yeah.
who's controlling? So he's implying, because it's not a compliment to say, "Oh, you're a puppet." You know, you're a puppet of this and
Right,
that.
not
Like, that's not a warm, endearing term, and yet he has a reverence for historical materialism, but he's also saying it's a theology.
I think that.
I mean, I don't know. That's what
I
mean,
think he's critiquing a mechanical historical
Okay.
That's what I think.
materialism,
Okay.
Yes.
where the revolution, it's
In
gonna
quotes.
come
Good point.
no matter what, as if there's someone pulling the strings.
Right.
And what I want to know, although obviously you can't get it just from this first thesis, it's in the whole thing, is that it doesn't seem to me that in all of this put together, that he's necessarily critiquing. It seems to me he's opening the door to a liberatory potential in theology. Am I correct, or do I have that wrong?
No, you had that right. I think, which puts Benjamin on the side of some kind of major religious figure, and you say that it's Paul
It's Paul.
of Jesus' time.
That's according to this Franz Hinkelhammer. Now, could I have a little space to say why he says that?
Sure.
Because he
Yeah,
gives.
of course, yeah.
Of course, we're looking for interpretations,
Okay.
not
Yeah.
truth.
Here's what he says. Hinkelhammer justifies this identification of the puppet of the hunchback with Paul on the basis of the following observations, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. So it goes like this. See if you find this convincing or not. But by his own admission, Benjamin's basic orientation was decidedly towards the biblical past.
Messianic, what he calls.
yeah.
Second, he lamented that the biblical wizened founders of modern thought remained hidden and out of sight. Third, in one of Benjamin's surviving fragments, the latter's close friend, Gershom Scholem, celebrated Paul as the most notable example of a revolutionary Jewish mystic. So he's familiar with this idea. Like the hunchback in Benjamin's story, Paul suffered from some kind of physical deformity as described in 2 Corinthians 12, 7-9. Next, Benjamin's description of the parable's puppet wearing Turkish attire reminds us that its hidden alleged puppet master, St. Paul, came specifically from Tarsus, which is located in modern-day Turkey. Next,
Constantinople.
other commentators, like Jacob Taubes, have found the presence of Paul's thinking prominent not only in Benjamin, but also in most important currents of modern thought, including that of Freud and Nietzsche. The latter, by the way, signaled support for this, for Hinkelhammer's point of view, by villainizing Paul for the apostles' anarchism, defense of the poor and oppressed, and prefiguration of Marx and of historical materialism. This is Nietzsche.
Wow.
And then finally, above all, Paul's criticism of law as the sin of the world prepared the way for critical theory's criticism of market law and of the state as the armed force imposing the will of the ruling class on the oppressed majority. For both Paul and critical theorists, complying with an oppressive law remains completely immoral.
Wow.
So that's the case that he's presenting in this book called la maledición que pesa sobre la ley, las raíces de pensamiento crítico en Pablo de Tarso.
I want to just add a little bit to that. When I saw the Occupy movement in New York walking the sidewalk rather than the street, and they had secured, I learned from somebody who was very active, a permit from the Department of Sanitation, maybe?
No, Al, Stanley, they didn't get
Or
any
the police
permits.
department, what?
Occupy didn't get any permits.
They did at some point.
Don't tell me they didn't get any permits. They did get a permit.
they-
They
some-
went
I
and
just read a
sought
history.
a permit.
At some point, they, anyway.
What?
No.
No, I'm just agreeing with you, Stanley. At
Yeah,
some point, I
it's
just
not.
read a short history. At some point, they got approval to do something, hang out there. I don't remember. Anyway.
This may have been an exception. But why would anybody want to have a demonstration and walk the regular street, the sidewalk, instead of the street? The occupation of the streets
Right.
and the occupation of the workplaces are parallel ways of disrupting traffic and production, etc.
Which your friend Benjamin knew very well in his study of Paris, capital city, and the Haussmann, barricades.
That's right.
I just now understood why I always saw you at critical mass.
At Critical Mass, Stanley?
Because
Critical Mass?
we
What
were
was that,
taking
religious
the
ceremony?
streets.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you on more than one occasion, you spoke before we set off into the streets with
Yes.
no permit,
No
with the
permit.
cops chasing us down,
That's right.
both my kids getting arrested at those things. And I was wondering, you're not a cyclist. Why were you there?
Was it a speech that I made at Union Square Park?
Yeah.
Okay.
Will Weicker
So,
put you
I
up to that?
remember making that speech. And I was just
Because
recalling.
critical mass didn't ask.
And Occupy
They took the
Daily
streets,
didn't
they
ask.
took public space.
Come on, it's
On
not.
bicycles.
We
It's
took the
very-
bridges.
And all kinds of
We
things.
took the
That's
West
right.
Side Highway.
Mm-hmm.
We shut down the West Side Highway.
That's right. Taxi cab drivers
Occupy
and
did too.
critical
Yeah,
mass.
we have to give Occupy a little credit, please.
What?
Occupy did too.
Occupy was in the
Of course.
streets
Yeah,
daily.
Occupy took
Yeah,
the
no,
Brooklyn
it
Bridge.
It wasn't,
They did.
if they did once, but it was like every single day for months in a row
Yeah.
of marches against traffic daily. So, yeah, I mean, it's important to acknowledge that
Yeah.
they weren't asking,
No, no,
if there's
I
one
didn't
account
mean
that
to
says that
imply
they,
that.
yeah,
I-
really, it's
No.
just,
In Philadelphia, where I was asked to speak inside, and so was Angela Davis. The Philadelphia Occupy always asked the police department for permission, and they occupied a space outside of City Hall, which was not a traffic space. There's a space outside of City Hall which is
That's
green.
the Frank Rizzo effect at work.
Right away.
That doesn't sound like Philly. Certainly not Philly
Yeah,
now.
yeah, I know, it
Phil
doesn't sound like
Occupy
it. No, but
ICE,
that- but,
they just took the space and then they got routed.
and then they
Right.
shut down all the court hearings as a
That's
result of
right.
that. It
So-
was a huge
And
backlash.
of course, the same
That
thing
doesn't
was
sound like
true
Philly.
of Oakland,
Doesn't sound
which
really-
never asked for permission. But if you say Occupy never asked for permission, I would love you to prove me wrong.
I'm sure I'm happy to, Stanley, really.
What?
I'm happy to. I mean, I don't mean to be, I was
Please
a
do.
participant
I
from day
don't
one,
think it's-
and I was in the spoke councils, and, so in terms of the event that people asked for permission, I was never witness to that. And
Well,
I'm
there
not
was
trying
a-
to say.
There was a march from Washington Square. There was, basically a sidewalk where there were barricades all the way
There
up
were-
to-
they were on the
to
sidewalk
thing.
sometimes,
Yeah, I
but
mean,
they
it
were
was
not
barricaded. It
police.
was a police orchestrated event where there obviously had to have been some kind of permits because there were barricades set up and people were on the sidewalks.
There are
and were
thousands
not
of
in the
marches in that
streets.
period in
Yeah,
terms of who
yeah.
actually
This
asked
was
somebody.
This was a huge one, though. I mean,
I-
10,
I-
15,000.
I might be misremembering because what
And the bulk
I,
of the left, when it
Yeah.
had demonstrations and marches,
Anyway, it helped Obama get elected.
asked for permits, especially the Communist Party and its periphery. It's a serious break. That's what I talked about when you heard me. The serious break was when people did not ask for permission, and when people did ask for when organizations asked for permission. Not asking for permission risks not only jail time, but maybe lengthy jail time. Also, if the cops decide are told to break it up, some brutality. Occupy did not ask for permission except on this occasion, but I don't think that I think it made a dent in their orientation, at least in New York.
Stanley, the National Lawyers Guild is often looking for legal observers, and they always distinguish between a demonstration that has permission and one that doesn't, because the demonstration without permission is the more likely to result in having to verify what kind of procedures or what kind of activities are taken by the police against the demonstrators. So
We used to call the Lawyers Guild before the invasion of the new generation of lawyers, young lawyers, about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. We used to call them the National Lawyers Guild.
National what?
Lawyers Guild.
Oh,
You know, the overwhelming majority of
Well, that's two strikes against me, Stanley. Lawyer and nonprofit worker. I mean, what can I say?
Well, it was on the issue of whether Paul was the origin, and that's pretty powerful that you read, Mike. You know, there's no doubt that the first thesis is a statement by Benjamin of a legacy which includes aspects of Christianity, at least. The Christian tradition, however, its theological aspect did hide itself. The only time it did not is when it had a school for prospective priests and monks, or priests who are scholars. It was for the masses. They did not have a doctrine, a theological doctrine that would approximate Martin Luther King's theology. We have no obligation, said King, to obey an immoral law. That's what he said. He was an advocate of morality in face of the law, which when people like Abernathy took over after his assassination, completely buried. The Christian Berrigan's notwithstanding, and King notwithstanding, Christian ministers are pretty much sworn to obey the law. Either they won't participate in the demonstrations of Occupy, or they will participate in the rally before the demonstration and not go on the demonstration. Yeah.
But the Occupy Faith was a very strong, active group, part of Occupy, and they were on the front lines of getting arrested a lot. Ed Judson and several other of the folks that are involved in the sanctuary movement now. So they were pretty active in getting direct action, being involved in direct action down there.
Yeah, but there's a lot of Christian ministers and priests that did not
Yeah, that's right.
support it morally and so on, but
Sanctuaries not like that now. Nowadays, sanctuary.
you know,
It's a different
what did you
environment.
say?
I was just saying that the new sanctuary group now is very different from
It's a
sanctuary.
totally
in the
different
80s.
context.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a different context,
Yeah.
but
Another way to read this, I mean, I think Beth really hit on something. One argument here is against mechanical materialism,
Yeah.
obviously. And another thing, you know, what you have called the inevitability thesis, that, you know, capitalism is inevitably going to survive, will survive. It's the only game in town, the Tino alternative. So what I think Benjamin is positioning here, and he takes, you know, I mean, with all due respect to St. Paul and all that as part of a larger background, you know, there is an 1836 piece, Mazel's Chess Player, that Edgar Allan Poe wrote in 1836. It's a short story, and there was a traveling chess player show that went to Richmond, Virginia, and went around the world, of which there was a dwarf who was inside, played the game of mirrors. So this was an actual arcades project of Benjamin that he's taking his inspiration from. And part of the problem, or at least the problematic, it seems to me, was Charles Babbage's, you know, algebraic predeterminations about, you know, that everything is predetermined and can be a part of a premise and conclusion of algebra at that time. Babbage was a British mathematician, you
But
know.
he was also a
who
businessman.
And a businessman, and Marx actually refers to him in Capital, on the economy of manufacturers. So anyway, Babbage is the first to develop a programmable machine. So in some ways, the chess player is an antagonist to the programmable machine, and can win against it because the chess player has a different set of moves and understands the program. And, you know, and, yeah, so I think he's actually talking about historical materialism itself is a far superior, you know, method, right? And can win if it understands the deductive logic of the programs, right, in some ways, you know, that he's...
How do you then, Michael,
Yeah,
how do
yeah,
you,
yeah.
what do you make of that word theology that he introduced?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, he's obviously in conversation with Scholem throughout his life, you know, in their letters. His two major correspondents were Scholem and Adorno. And, you know, I think very much that Scholem being a, you know, a Talmudic scholar, etc.
Gerhard Scholem became Gershom Scholem, which is his original name.
Right.
And was a very close friend of Benjamin.
Sally, sorry.
And he was on his way to Israel to live, and he wanted Benjamin to come along, and Benjamin resisted. But they still retained a very close relationship. Thank you. You want to take it? A very close relationship. And that close relationship has been a very important clue as to what Benjamin was doing in his theories, in his observations. All right.
Stanley, you
And
want to...
unprogrammable, a messianic conception of history. It's much more contingent than programmable. That's another thing, too, that I think he's going against here, is the predetermined mathematics of a programmable machine. You know,
Maybe I
in a way.
was too
Maybe we can
influenced.
talk about artificial intelligence, because if you rewrite this for today, Deep Blue would be your model, right? I mean, the IBM machine that played
Yes.
Kasparov in chess and, you know, beat Kasparov, et cetera.
And Go,
Yeah.
the Chinese game, which is
Chinese
much more
game.
complex
And
than
Go. And
yeah,
Go is a much more complex.
than game than chess.
Right.
Far superior in
Right,
terms of
right.
complexity.
So
Yeah.
what is the automaton, in your analysis, what does the automaton represent?
historical materialism.
Mechanical.
No, but isn't it
Mechanical
Stalinism? Or
Kind of
is it-
Stalinism.
Right?
Yeah,
Isn't
yeah.
that what this
No, no,
is?
no.
Well, yeah, like, you know, I have friends whose politics is Stalinist, and they believe that the working class is a sleeping giant which will awake,
That's right.
and it will simply awake, and then it will assume its role.
Right,
It's got a role in history.
right. Somebody's got to
Do
light the
you know-
fire. like the gas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you know
But no, but-
do you know the phrase that the left has predicted 9 of the last 4 economic crises?
3 weeks ago, huh?
No, 19,
No, I'm just kidding.
2000,
Yes, I know.
2008, Michael.
Yeah, I know, no, I meant the October disaster in the equity markets that now look like ancient history.
Marx's view of the economic crisis was that this was a necessary prelude to the further expansion of capitalism. That the economic crisis was not the beginning of the end of capitalism, but the beginning of a
It's
new
capital.
phase
Yeah.
of expansion. The debate in 1929, the Trotskyists and the Stalinists both believed that 1929 economic crisis was the beginning of the end of capitalism. They agreed because they were both mechanical materialists, economic determinists.
Bourgeoisie thought so too, right?
No, they came up with it, don't mean a thing if it ain't got no swing. You know, that started the journey back.
A version of not mechanical materialism, but economic materialism, called the Council Communists, whose leading figures were Anton Pannekoek of Holland, Paul Maddock, who was a machinist in the United States.
Porsche to a degree.
What?
Carl Porsche to a degree.
Course, to the degree that he could understand what they were doing.
Right.
They
Fair
were
enough.
contemptuous of the CP and the Trotskyists. He thought they were mechanical materialists. And they wrote about it. And they actually took Stalinism on and Trotskyism on throughout the 1930s in a publication called International Correspondence, it was called. Pannekoek really was the main figure, but Paddock was a very important part of it as well. And I have the collection. It was collected by people that I knew, and they produced 5 volumes, which were published by Greenwood Press, a small Connecticut press. For $100, you can get the 5 volumes, and I bought them, and I own them. And they're worth reading because a lot of it is very intelligent stuff. Not all economic determinists, but at least their special field was political economy. They really didn't have a significant cultural theory or cultural set of cultural observations. But within that limitation, they were extremely, I think, important. The Institute finally bought them out in 1943, but they published continuously from 1935 or 4 to 1942. And then what happened was that Partisan Review gave them space to publish their stuff. And they published in Partisan Review, but they had archives. And the Frankfurt School, so-called, bought the archives. And now I guess they released a good part of the articles if you're interested. International Council Correspondence, I think it's called, yeah. All right,
Should we go to the
we've
next?
gone as far as we can go now.
I have,
Could I make-
I have a question.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you want to go in the order of these theses,
Well,
Stanley.
go
but the
ahead, that's
10th
okay.
The 10th
Yeah.
says, "The themes which monastic discipline assigned to friars for meditation were designed to turn them away from the world and its affairs. The thoughts which we are developing here originate from similar considerations."
Which thesis is
This
this?
is 10.
10.
258.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not clear to me how we are connecting what the connection is to moving away from a traditional approach to understanding history without ignoring history.
Well, what he said is, he said the thought which we are developing here originate here. Thoughts or the thought stuff that we are developing here originate from similar considerations.
Right, I assume that refers to turning away from the world and its
At a moment-
affairs.
At a
So-
moment when the politicians in whom the opponents of fascism had placed their hopes are prostrate and confirmed their defeat by betraying their own cause, these observations are intended to disentangle the political world. What's your problem?
Monasticism.
Can I make a
That's a good, that's the
really
one
wanna
to
know?
overcome, yeah.
I have a
What's your
suggestion.
question?
I will spare you the
No, please
prologue.
ask the question again.
That I'm not sure if what the similar considerations are this idea of turning away from the world and its affairs. So
Yeah.
how, I don't understand how he then wants us, no, that's not accurate. I don't understand then how we look at history and at the same time are turning away from the world and its affairs, how we
Well,
encompass
it's not conventional history that he's talking about.
Right.
What he's talking about is a new thematic.
Right. Which is this, nunc stans, right? Stans, nunc stans,
Which is what?
which is history being embodied in a single moment. All of history being embodied in a single moment. And being able to experience and grasp its meaning in that singularity, as opposed to looking at history chronologically.
History flits by, but if you catch it in that moment, that's good. But there's something else, isn't there?
Undoubtedly.
Is there, I mean, is there a criticism of, I mean, the way that social democrats were looking at history under the assumption that progress was
Yes.
going to happen?
Right.
Is
Yeah.
we're both looking
Yeah.
at history and
This is
turning
very
away from the
connected
actual
to
events.
Adorno's essay
Yes.
on
Yeah,
progress.
that's
one thing, but-
Extremely close.
But
to
the
The
other
last
thing,
sentence,
the
read
other
the
thing
last
that's very
sentence.
And that's what I
important.
wanted to
I'm
suggest.
sorry?
Read the last, you
I've been
read it.
wanting to say, the last sentence to me is helpful.
Read that.
You read
Let's
it.
read it.
It seeks to convey an idea of the high price our accustomed thinking will have to pay for a conception of history that avoids any complicity with the thinking to which these politicians continue to
Yeah.
adhere.
Right.
To me, this is, he's saying that we have a big problem if we're going to try to think outside the box and not be mentally
And
sold out,
what is the prime
controlled.
example that he would be referring to? The Popular Front,
Oh.
Yes.
the communist and socialist alliance that took over the government of France in the face of the Spanish Civil War, which failed, which refused to buck the embargo that made every excuse it could find not to intervene, and left the intervention mainly in terms of token intervention to the Soviet Union. But the Popular Front is the doctrine that all socialists, all the socialist and workers' movements, if they unite, should be able to stop fascism or stop the right. The Popular Front had no program of socialism, transcending capitalism. It was an anti-fascist program. And he's arguing, and the anti-fascist program, when in power, dissolves.
Right. Liberals are easy to use.
That's my reading.
Yeah, and he says, I mean, to back that up, our consideration, earlier sentence, middle of the thesis 11, proceeds from the insight that the politicians' stubborn faith and progress want.
Let us catch you.
Yeah, slow down, please.
Slow down, slow
Okay,
down.
okay. Our consideration proceeds from the insight that the politicians' stubborn faith in progress, their confidence in their mass basis, and finally their servile integration in an uncontrollable apparatus have been three aspects of the same thing.
I have
I don't see that.
I have
sentence.
another comment. That's a good thing.
Yeah, I don't see the sentence.
It's the middle of.
It's the
10
middle of
thesis.
10, on page, on
middle of
page
the
258.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's not 11, it was 10.
10, I'm
Okay.
sorry, not 11.
Yeah.
I made a mistake,
okay.
11. I mean, I
Okay.
made a mistake from Marx, yeah. I
The
know where my
politicians'
unconscious
stubborn
is.
faith in progress, their confidence in
sorry
their
about
mass
that.
basis,
Yeah, this
and
is
finally
fine.
their servile integration into the uncontrollable
Healthy state.
apparatus.
Okay.
Look,
Yeah, yeah.
I
We are
guess,
now-
I guess
we are
the
now-
confusion I felt, Stanley, was
what
that
would you say?
the confusion I felt, or what, the connection that was not clear to me, was that he started out with monastic disciplines that were turning them away from the world. So I presume that that's just a reference back to his connection to understanding or exposure or involvement with Christian.
I think that's probably there. That's right.
Okay.
But there is something about turning away from the world
Yeah,
which is powerful.
yeah.
If you turn away from the world, you're signaling that you are resisting the status quo.
Okay.
And the problem we have today that is related to this thesis is the following. His name is Bernie Sanders. He's the new Popular Front. He promises the New Deal, no, it's before the New Deal. He promises a very elementary program of reform on the assumption that we can undertake significant reforms under capitalism and not have to pay for them. And we have now the recruitment of literally millions of people into the electoral process in the hopes that if we elect
Right.
a
A nice
couple of
Hillary
thousand-
Clinton.
I-
Yeah,
No, not
I'm
Hillary
just
Clinton.
kidding.
Any
Elizabeth
equivalent.
Warren,
Elizabeth Warren.
Good. Well,
Whatever
Bernie
liberal
Sanders,
douchebag is trying to get elected, sorry.
that we're going to change the world. In the first place, that assumption fails to take into account the Popular Front. There wasn't a single popular member of the elected representatives and senators who match the programmatic politics of the Popular Front of France. Not one. If you listen to Amy Goodman interview this one, that one, the third one, the fifth one, they all say the same thing. And that is nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. It's important that an American, Native American, get elected to Congress. A lot of women are elected. That's very important. We have X number of blacks running, X number of women running, and that is essentially anti-racist. I would argue that it's not essentially anti-racist. It is the National Lawyers Guild. It is the national middle class,
Tokenism.
moderate, and leftist guilt. Nobody among them is articulating
Right.
a program that goes beyond,
Right.
certainly beyond the
Right.
Great Society of Johnson, which was ahead of Roosevelt.
Well,
They
poverty
have-
rates went down under the
What?
Great Society programs, too. The poverty rates went down in the United States.
That's what he's saying.
That's what you're saying, so
Yeah.
it was better.
Yeah.
You're saying, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's
But more salient than even all that is their reliance on the electoral process.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big turn of the Communist International of 1934 and 35, first in France. The American Communist Party until 1934 would have laughed at anybody who thought that the election of George Norris from Nebraska or Fiorello LaGuardia from New York was going to have a fundamental
Right.
effect on the structure of society. The CP would have laughed at it. The socialists ran Norman Thomas for president as a protest, but they had local mayors, particularly in Reading, Pennsylvania, but in a couple of other places. But they did not believe, they were not naive enough to believe that they were making structural changes by contesting the elections. Thomas said, I'll tell you how bad it was. Thomas, who was the socialist candidate for president in 1932, said, Roosevelt stole our program. Can you imagine?
Oh, boy.
We haven't had, in any kind of widespread conversation, a discussion of the alternative since 1934. And that alternative, namely the Soviet Union and socialist revolution outside of the Soviet Union, that alternative dissipated in practice quite quickly. It was over by 1936. It became exclusively anti-fascist. When the workers occupied the factories in behalf of the loyalists, on behalf of the socialist communist government of Spain, the army was called to eject them. We are not going to occupy the factories. We are going to observe the law, which is that we are not contesting capitalism. That's what the leaders of the Popular Front told the workers. The anarchists were the only group, and the POUM, to disavow the government on that issue. But they did in fact come back together and fought the fascists on the battlefront when Franco made a war in Spain. They defended Spain, the Spanish Republic, which I think was a good thing to do. But they had, but their sense of revolutionary program was completely dissipated by fascism, and I believe that Trump has, to a large extent, dissipated any radicalism in this country of any consequence, temporarily.
Yeah.
The media are full of anti-Trump horseshit.
Trying to get to the text.
It's a bonanza to them.
Sure.
It's made the media rich again. Raised Nielsen ratings is the best thing that could happen to the media. You know, you can tell Rachel Maddow, tongue-in-cheek, of course, I made your career.
Do you guys think we can get to the text a little bit?
Yeah.
What'd you say?
Do you think we can read Thesis 2?
Of course.
That would be...
Could I have one hangover question
You
from
read- you
Thesis
read it.
1?
We're
Okay.
ready to reach
Okay.
Thesis
Ben,
two.
could
Yeah.
I just ask one question about Thesis 1, because I think I misinterpreted it. The way I read it, I have the Turkish puppet controlled by Paul playing against the automaton. The
Yes.
automaton.
Yes.
Oh,
That's the programmer, is the mechanical materialism.
well,
Yes,
I identified the automaton
Yes.
as, what did I
The
say?
Turkish puppet has strings,
Has
and
the strings,
yeah,
right.
the little guy under the table is
Yeah.
pulling them. So
Yeah.
But he's playing against, I thought it was automated technology. This
No.
was probably from my reading or discussion of Adorno, but I thought the opponent was automated.
No. Yeah.
No,
That's not what I saw.
No,
no,
yeah.
that's,
But I
then
had
I
to
got
read
that
it 2
wrong.
times.
Let's be direct. Since we're reading Benjamin, we're reading Adorno. We've done both.
Yeah.
The Institute hovered back and forth on the question of technology. By the 1950s and 60s, they believed that technology was part of the answer. But in the 1920s, technology was an enemy. In the 1930s, it was an enemy. But also could be a friend under the proper aegis. Marcuse in One Dimensional Man goes so far as to say that with technology we can advance civilization qualitatively, meaning we can change the structure. When I talked to him in the 1970s, he had personally disavowed that idea, which was in One Dimensional Man. I said, but you have to speak about it because people read One Dimensional Man, and they think that's where you stand unless you take another position. You can
Yeah.
say, I was partially wrong, I was all wrong, I made a mistake, I want to correct it, but you didn't. And he didn't. He never did.
Stan-
do you want to? Oh, sorry.
Can we read? Go ahead,
Can you
Ben.
just
Why don't
say-
you read Thesis 2?
But can I just get you to say what you just said in a sentence? What Marcuse never explained, never took back.
What'd you say?
I wanted to hear you summarize what you just said. Marcuse never took back in One Dimensional Man that
Never
technology.
took back the promise of technology,
Okay,
of capitalist technology.
I see. Okay,
He never took it back.
okay.
Let Ben read, because I know he's got to catch a train.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was just
Go
trying
ahead,
to...
Ben, why
yeah.
don't you read?
Okay, so one of the most remarkable characteristics of human nature, writes Litza, is alongside so much selfishness in specific instances, the freedom from envy which the present displays towards the future. Reflection shows us that our image of happiness is thoroughly colored by the time to which the course of our own existence has assigned us. The kind of happiness that could arouse envy in us exists only in the air we have breathed, among people we could have talked to, women who could have given themselves to us. In other words, our image of happiness is indisputably bound up with the image of redemption. The same applies to our view of the past, which is the concern of history. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referred to redemption. There is a secret redemption agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. The claim cannot be settled cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that. So we've got so much in this, right? I mean, there's this question about selfishness, one generation to the next, and is there an obligation of one generation to the next?
Happiness?
Can we believe in that? Yeah, happiness. I mean,
Your bagel.
yeah, the bagel. I believe in happiness, but you know, so is happiness bound in redemption, or is it?
Two schools.
Yeah.
One school of historical materialists believe that a consistent struggle for reform, while it may not transform society as a whole, can actually improve the chances for happiness, and some sections of the population can actually achieve it. The other school is that no happiness without the abolition of exploitation of labor, and no happiness without the successful confrontation with bourgeois ideology. Is happiness itself possible is a third school, although it doesn't have an articulate single article or model which argues against the possibility of happiness per se. That school argues that happiness is an example of bourgeois ideology. It's a promise that can never be fulfilled. What we can fulfill is a society of understanding. That's where Habermas gets this notion of communication. Yeah. That we're not going to have happiness, we're going to have mutual understanding. But we're going to have enlightenment. The Institute is still struggling for understanding. That's its main concern. Most of them, I believe, do not believe in the possibility of happiness under the present system. Now, that is an illusion. I think Benjamin believed the same thing. And among the illusions is that we can have happiness.
Could you review the distinction you made a couple weeks ago between redemption and salvation, and how that might play in the translation of this? Because I'm wondering about that. Do I need redemption or salvation for me to be happy?
He says, in
Sure.
other words, our image of happiness is indissolubly bound up with the image of redemption.
Is this waiting for the Messiah, the second coming, and this? Or?
Well, waiting for the Messiah is a metaphor.
Hefty.
It's a metaphor for the
Never showed up.
never showed up.
Got killed.
See, I think the main thing is
John Garfield.
why Benjamin is so important. I mean, aside from his many insights that are worthy of our attention, not only Benjamin, but look, I had one long evening with Hannah Arendt, who called me and said, I want to talk to you. I went to her house. the issue is whether Messiah ever comes, whether redemption is genuinely possible. Now, what we've learned, and I think he learned, is that the Messiah never comes. As long as we have conflict, much less contradiction, redemption is, and therefore the Messiah, redemption is very unlikely. But the fight for redemption can be interlinked with the fight for a new society.
Can I quote Benjamin in this context?
Yeah.
He said once that we must have hope for those who do not have hope.
It's in
Yeah.
here.
Period, yes. And
Yeah.
so he says this. I mean, you know, this is really
And Marcuse's
his
one-dimensional
idea.
man
Yeah.
ends
And-
with that line.
And the redemption, it seems to me, in the sense of saving the phenomena, is not really about salvation in the Christian sense, or, ultimately the kingdom or something like that. It's about saving the text, saving the culture, if you will, of the book, saving this kind of moment. This seems to me to be his, and again, the Arendtian moment in the Benjamin was not a philosopher. He was not interested in concept. He was interested in names. He was interested in the atomic notion of names. There's something very profound about his theory of language. I mean, I really suggest reading of language as
Yes,
such.
he says that
Very
more than
beautiful.
once.
Yes, more than once. So there's this element of really saving the phenomena of the text, whatever you want, and something that obviously Derrida takes up from Benjamin and, the Frankfurt School and others, yeah.
It's
The main point, aside from the main point is that if the revolution does not address culture and simply confines its achievement to the ownership and control of the means of production, it will not even get close to redemption, which is necessary. Because people, as long as they have adopted an alien ideology, that is alien to their interests and alien to the culture that they want to be at some level, they will never achieve liberation. Liberation presupposes a preservation of aspects of culture which are liberatory, and the adoption of new liberatory aspects of culture, which are embodied in texts, but I don't think it's exclusively texts.
when I read this, there's a secret agreement between past generations and the present one at the end of the thesis. I think about
Thesis 2.
in thesis 2. I think about there's social security. That's a New Deal perspective that one generation is going to be in a compact with the next generation to be able to have material goods to retire. Or will my children have a
That's
world
right.
where we have not exploited the world so much that they will have a world? Or the UN report that says in 20 years, it's a shit show. We're on our way to the shit show. So that's that question about what's one generation's obligation to the next. I mean, we fought the tax bill last year, and they are
Well,
taking everything out to get tax cuts for the rich right now, so that our kids will have no Social Security.
It's also working in the
Right,
opposite
no.
direction.
That's
Yeah.
what I thought.
Yeah.
Why?
Say it. That's
Where
what I
the,
thought.
Like the present generation owes the past generation
Yes.
as well.
Yes.
Right, which is part of, I think,
Yeah.
the end
Yeah.
of Thesis 6, where even the dead won't be saved from the enemy.
Right,
So
right.
like, if we give up this struggle that's been fought by previous generations, then not only are we gonna lose, but everything they fought for is gonna lose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the image of the icon, the Angelus Novus of Paul Klee.
And the past
Yeah.
generation is
One is looking
history.
forward, but
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
backward.
Not the future.
Simultaneously. Yeah.
Not the future old people that
Yeah.
we are currently getting our paycheck docked for.
Yeah.
But in fact, the history.
Yeah.
And that was why I know I got scoffed at and expelled by Stanley when I said that I felt that progress had a positive, that
Yeah.
Adorno's progress had a positive element to it. And that positive element to me was this statement that we have got to stay on top of these things. and that is a reminder, if not a positive statement, it is a reminder that the struggle must go on from both a historical perspective, meaning history in these terms, and looking into the future, not just preparing us for a future of so-called progress, but also battling on behalf of the antecedents that we owe, essentially.
Well, it's an interesting idea. We have now not many years, roughly 50 years, since any small changes were made in the original legislation. The original legislation, as Congress intended it, under a lot of pressure from below, was to have a pension, a government-sponsored pension system that equaled 50% of the last 5 years of what you earned when you retired. In addition to that, you should have had savings, you should have paid off your house, you should have been able to afford a rent that was reasonable. We are in a position now where the betrayal is profound. The top rate for Social Security is around $30,000 a year, plus minus. On $30,000 a year, a teachers union member in New York City who has spent 20 years on the job is only getting a third of her last 5 years. They're making $90,000 to $100,000. But if you're in West
Should
Virginia,
run for office again.
what'd you say?
Should run for office again.
Who?
We need that kind of rhetoric out there. You know?
We have none of it at all.
Yeah,
None of it at all.
it's really horrible.
It is true. I'm getting $30,000 Social Security benefit. They just raised the benefit 2.5%.
2.8.
Yes. Who counts the last?
Yeah.
The 3/10 of 1%.
Anyway,
Yeah.
but that
Some
doesn't
people
equal. I made more than $60,000 the last 5 years. And anybody in my position made more than $60,000. Any public school teacher in New York City, 5 years, is making more
Now
than
they're starting.
Okay,
$60,000.
Stanley, Mitch McConnell is assured that the program is bankrupt, so it
He's
won't be
right.
there, yes.
He's right. No money, no more 50%, except in the most impoverished cases.
Jeff Bezos is holding on to it for us.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
The
In Long
Democrat,
Island City next.
We'll have to
yeah.
work for it.
there's a op-ed in the New York Times that the Democrats need a strategy, a rural strategy, which is a strategy for the poor, at least part of it. The Democrats will never have a strategy for the poor. Why? Because they are committed to what they call the middle class.
Right.
They never talk about the poor. They never talk about the fact that Social Security has become, at best, a inadequate amount per month for the poor, at best. Because they hope to win the suburbs and the middle class in the cities, and my guess is that they may win. That the chances of winning at this point are probably 55%, even beating Trump in 2020. I'm not sure they will beat Trump if they nominate Hillary Clinton. The only chance of them winning, I think, is if they take their most progressive wing, of which Brown of Ohio would be the best example. He is a completely charming person with progressive politics, who's a senator, who's been around a while. He gets on TV. Elizabeth Warren would not win.
She gets slaughtered.
What'd you say?
She'd be slaughtered. It was not an
Yeah.
interest on win. Yeah, at this point. Yeah.
She would not win.
In her acceptance, her celebratory speech, Nancy Pelosi actually said to the assembled crowd, "Let's hear it for pre-existing conditions.
Yes.
Let's hear
You
it
mean all
for
that real estate she owns in the
hypertension,
Bay Area?
asthma, cancer." That's what she
Sounds like a
said.
Saturday Night Live skit.
But the secret agreement that Ben can't hear now.
Yeah.
The secret agreement has been betrayed. This was to be a society of steady progress for a certain portion of the population. It
Oh, I
has been
see.
betrayed.
Right.
American dream.
It's one of Stiegler's better books.
What?
One of Stiegler's better books is Taking Care of Generations. I mean, it's a very accessible book, but he actually tries to reframe and reconceptualize the problem of transmission, vis-à-vis this. I mean, he doesn't take Benjamin's, but it's the same thematic in a way, how this betrayal took place and how you restore, some kind of faith into the, future.
I wonder if a single member of the United States Congress has introduced a piece of legislation which never would pass under the present Congress anyway, but introducing a piece of legislation which says that Social Security can never be less than 50% of any individual's salary over the last 5 years.
You can pay for that with 1/10 of a penny on every stock transaction going in.
Yeah.
You pay for it like that.
Yeah.
Toby
1/10
test.
of a penny.
So
Not
I
even a
think
penny.
That's really.
You advocated for a penny, I think, in the Green Party.
But that's
Yeah.
where,
Yeah, well,
that's where the union has come in.
Yeah.
As difficult as I found it to be a union member, at least in terms of retirement packages
mean
and the
the-
contracts, the UFT is better than Social Security.
The UFT,
Yes.
is
The
it
pension is better.
AFT?
Yeah, but the problem with that is that only 35% of the people in the United States have pensions.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's,
It's a
it's,
65%.
but I'm saying,
Yeah,
you would have
yeah,
more
yeah.
hope
Yeah.
of boostering
Yeah.
union
Yeah.
pensions than getting
Yeah.
Congress or
Yeah.
the
I
United
think
States
that, I
government.
think that contributes to a massive conformism, and that's a game that is played between Wall Street and the union.
Look.
Ultimately, but that's a
The
long story.
program of
Yeah.
the socialist and communist and the labor movement of the 1930s was what we now call single payer, socialized medicine they called it. That program would have made unnecessary collective bargaining pension programs. It never saw the light of day. And when it was resolved badly, the unions decided they're going to take care of their members by enacting a private Social Security program. I am the beneficiary of a private Social Security program, but I have to put in 10% of my income to make anything like a decent pension, because the City University of New York under contract must put in another 10%, plus Social Security. But it's only good if you're in good health. When I had a stroke and came off the stroke needing care, my Social Security plus my pension was not good enough. It is not good enough without insurance. I bought some insurance separately from John Hancock. And most people don't have that agreement. That was a union agreement, that you could buy Social Security through John Hancock at a reduced price.
Long-term care
Long-term,
insurance,
yeah. but 65% of the population has no pension.
Well, there was a recent article, I can't remember which major newspaper, that it's now flipped and the majority of fast food workers are now retirement age people.
Majority of fast food workers.
Is that right?
It's that long, right, since Ray Kroc developed
Good
McDonald's.
grief.
But you can't retire.
That's
When you go to the
amazing.
south,
Ray Kroc is shit. you know.
like, because my son used to go to school in Asheville, you see old people in all of the fast foods.
Asheville,
The,
North
what do they
Carolina?
call Waffle House. Waffle
Right.
House was all old people, and there was a guy who looked about 90 who was the greeter at the door.
You mean, Asheville, North
Cracker
Carolina?
Barrel. That's the other one.
Back,
Cracker Barrel.
Asheville,
What a
North
name,
Carolina?
Cracker Barrel.
North Carolina.
Yeah, North Carolina. That's the only Asheville I've heard of.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
Are you ready?
Never thought of that, Michael.
Yeah, right.
Are you ready for three?
Yeah, let's do
Mike, you
three.
want to read
I
three?
never
Oh,
thought
three,
of
yes,
this.
please.
That's very
That's
evil.
because Glenn Ford's in the next room. Anyway,
A chronicler who recites events without distinguishing between major and minor ones acts in accordance with the following truth. Nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. To be sure, only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, which is to say, only for a redeemed mankind has its past become citable in all its moments. Each moment it has lived becomes a citation à l'ordre du jour, and that day is Judgment Day.
Comments? Questions?
I don't get it.
The way I translated that was to see if this this is short. It is true that no event is insignificant in the long course of history. However, the significance of particular events can only be known at history's conclusion.
Which some people think is already occurred,
Right,
right?
right.
We have no more history.
It's the end of
End of
history.
ideology,
That's right.
end of history.
Fukuyama said we did not have any more history because
He's
we have
taken it back.
Yeah, I was
democracy.
gonna say, he took it back,
He
right?
took it back, yeah. But
not-
he-
not complete,
He
he's
took
not a
it back
dummy.
later, but yeah, but that was the pronouncement.
But when he says
wasn't
only
alone,
a
obviously.
redeemed mankind,
That's right.
is he not
Indeed.
talking about only
New
mankind
beginnings,
who
new
has,
beginning days for
who-
Thesis and London.
Has only been liberated.
has found freedom? Only
Yes.
that the redemption is basically kind of a synonymous with freedom.
Freedom,
And
yeah.
yet redemption is only a possibility in the future.
It's kind of like a full temporality, I think he's really geared towards here, ultimately.
So we can only
Fullness
receive
of
the
time.
fullness of the past when we've been liberated.
Yeah,
Then-
but look at this.
More to
Look at the example from American history. It was in the middle of, exactly the middle of, a little bit more than that, the Civil War, that Lincoln declared the end of slavery, emancipation. The war was not conducted on the basis of the emancipation of the slaves. So there's another part of this conversation that he only hints at, Benjamin. That is to say, we may enter a period of genuine progress in the course of struggle. It's not going to happen by somebody who hands down liberation or redemption or freedom. It may be the outcome of struggle. But the problem is that if nothing happens as a result of struggle, which is redeemable, or nothing happens that is significantly redeemable, so it also has freedom as part of it, at the outcome of struggle, it may not reappear for a long time. That's why you can't be for peace. there's too much left undone, and he talks about that. The present generation has a lot to ask the past what it should be doing. And I think the present generation should be asking the past, should it now return to socialized medicine? That's just one.
Right.
Or the original intent of Congress, or the 1/10 of 1% of the tax burden. Any of these things. But what they always said, what Marcuse and Adorno and Benjamin are always asking is, why hasn't it happened?
This is hard for me, Stanley, just in light of the last 2 weeks in particular, with the mass shootings, but in particular, the temple shooting, which is definitely connected with the group being going back to 1881 and helping refugees come to America. And for that particular temple to be targeted is so obviously a direct result of Trump's rhetoric. And as I've noticed, as his hair becomes blonder rather than orange, and those social realist pictures of him standing like this, and in terms of critiquing the media and what's going on, I mean, this is such a horrible time to even think about going further when actually, if you can reread this by saying nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. So, I mean, it's... That's my say on it, but it's I don't see it stopping. I don't see it stopping with the mass shootings going on and on. It's part of the nature of the day. And
Yeah, I
whether
think
it's a yoga
Benjamin's-
studio or a nightclub or a movie or a school or a church or a temple now, but a temple specifically helping refugees.
How long would you? It goes on and on and on and on without hints of redemption. And nobody raises the question of redemption or freedom?
Well, Trump is. He's pretending this is the freedom that he's giving you, free from all of the rest of the
left
world.
has given up
Free to be
freedom
white.
to the right.
And Christian right. We have to talk about
They
the
never talk,
evangelicals.
the
That's
left
his,
never talks about freedom.
That's his base, and that's his media platform
I
too.
think Stan-
CNN
I think-
or Christian
White
broadcasting.
evangelicals.
Yeah,
Whiting it.
What'd you say?
white evangelicals.
I'm trying to draw attention to what you're saying, which
Yeah,
I
what-
think is a bit different.
Yeah.
You're saying, you just said the left never talks about freedom.
Well, it gave up freedom to the right.
Yeah.
Gave
Yeah.
up
Pretty
freedom.
clear.
Fuck
It
yeah.
gave it up,
Okay.
it relinquished it. It
Okay.
had some kind of sense of freedom in the 60s and early
If you-
70s. I mean, the path that you can go through the groups and the changes and the movement politics. But somehow, in the 70s and the early 80s, this was relinquished
If you did
to
a s-
the right.
if you did a
The whole
survey-
discourse
if you-
changed.
Yeah.
If you did a survey
Yeah.
right now of
You're
Americans,
well,
a
yeah.
substantial portion would say the left is against freedom.
Yeah.
Yes, well,
Not a majority, I don't think, but a big portion would.
I think that's what the Ellen Willis essay is about, and that's why I keep that on my desktop. I think
Yeah.
that when was it written? It was so
Ellen's essay
prescient.
was written in the 2000s.
What essay was that?
I'll show
Yeah,
you.
which
on
essay?
Thomas Frank.
What's the matter with Thomas
Oh, yeah,
Frank?
I
replaced
did see that.
situations, yeah. She graciously
It
gave
was
us that
about
essay.
2000. When did the book come out?
2006.
His book was.
It was 2006 she wrote it. 2005 she wrote it,
No,
yeah.
she-
And then presented it in 2006.
Yeah.
She was, she argued with Cathopolit at NYU. Yeah, no, it was horrible that day, yeah.
I can't imagine
And
that.
Zaretsky
matchup.
kind of defended her. I was there.
Oh, really?
You can't imagine what?
I can't imagine Ellen Willis on the stage with someone so so utterly pedestrian as Kathy Pollitt.
Well, it
Ouch.
basically told me that day.
Yeah, it hurt.
She was
They
on
knew
stage.
each other.
She was on stage with a lot of people who were
Right, pedestrian.
utterly banal.
That's part of the job, right?
Yeah, and getting worse, Pollitt.
Getting worse, yeah, sure.
I have a burning question, which is a little off topic,
I
but
agree with you.
Stanley, you were talking about the United Front selling out, in my
I was
words.
talking
Popular.
about,
You were talking about
Popular
the
Front.
Popular Front
Popular.
selling
Yeah.
out, is how I would put it. I'm stuck with the idea that that was a reasonable approach at the time, right? Because fascism was the danger, blah, 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 but we have to unite with the liberals. I just wonder what you think the right thing would have been to do, given the situation.
well, in the case of France, before 1939, when they knew that the invasion was imminent, they could have linked a popular anti-fascist movement with a whole series of discussions and practical actions which went beyond it. I mean, how is it going to happen if we wait for the proper moment and in the meantime betray it? I can't. The Popular Front in the United States, and I have written this, you may want to read it if you haven't read it. It's in the Death of Unions. What is the last book called?
Life and Death of
Life
American
and Death of
Labor.
American Labor.
That's right.
I said the death of American labor was when they signed on to the National Labor Relations Act,
1935.
Wow.
1935.
Right.
That worker struggles under the law mean that the worker struggles are regulated by
Right.
the state
Right.
and in turn by capital.
Yeah.
And they never grasped this. They were grateful that they fought for some kind of liberation, but what they got was a new
Regulation.
chain, a new
Yeah.
noose.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Could I ask you to read number 8, which I think responds to?
You want me to read
Yeah,
number 8?
you're gonna call me a hypocrite, aren't you?
You are a hypocrite.
I know.
See that?
I
Yeah,
know.
Yeah, it's okay.
I'm
What-
ashamed.
You know?
What have you done bad?
You know, that's what, that fits with Baudelaire. Mon hypocrite.
You want me to read number 8?
Mon hypocrite.
No, Michael's reminding me that it's time.
No,
I'll
it's
read it.
okay.
I'll
Let's
read
do
it if you
that.
want.
Yeah, it's okay.
Since you
Yeah.
referred to
Come
it.
on,
It's a
guys.
friendly.
It's fine. It's
Somebody else read it.
fun.
Maybe I can convince
Yeah.
somebody else to.
Yeah.
Well, I'll read it, all right. In short, the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain to a conception of history that is in keeping with this insight. Then we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency, and this will improve our position in the struggle against fascism. One reason why fascism has a chance is that in the name of progress, its opponents treat it as a historical norm. The current amazement that the things we are experiencing are still possible is in the 20th century is not philosophical. This amazement is not the beginning of knowledge unless it is the knowledge that the view of history which gives rise to it is untenable. You wanted me to read that for what reason?
It's about today.
Because I thought that you were kind of suggesting a rupture in terms of the current Trumpian moment, and what I hear him saying is that we live in a state of emergency.
What he says, Well, if you believe that that Trump represents a state of emergency and that is a legitimate reading of the present situation, I believe you would be optimistic. A state of emergency is when not only the system of law is violated, but when the fundamental assumption of the phony freedom that has existed since slavery is abolished. That phony freedom is we are free to work where we want, we are free to live where we want. When we recognize not that we are not free to live and work where we want, and this now becomes a political program, that will be a state of emergency. Because I think Trump is consistent with, although he breaks here and there, he's consistent with the basic program of the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party's foreign policy is identical to what he's doing. This is not from the point of view of capital a state of emergency. His rhetoric and his actions are abominable, but they are all possible. If you declare a state of emergency like Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in 1941, that was no state of emergency. The mass draft. We had a draft since the Civil War. It simply wasn't enforced. And he said, suspend all freedoms for the length of the war, which we did. And of course, what the liberals and the left have pointed to was the non-enforceable $25,000 a year maximum salary for executives, which they never observed, or almost never observed, except if they didn't have it available.
So do we want to continue with Benjamin next week? And is that the?
What time is
Pick
it?
this one
It's
up.
it's after 2.
5
now.
after 2.
5 after 2.
I think we should continue with Benjamin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pick up on this
Great.
question too, because
Yeah.
And please,
Well, I mean, I think the reference is Carl
not
Schmidt
only
here.
2 or 3
On state of
people or
emergency.
4
I'll go
people
back, I'll give some
participate. Will you
contextual.
please keep quiet for a
Yeah,
minute?
sure.
Thank you. Everybody should have questions or comments. To be silent in this kind of a close reading is, in many ways, to basically to deprive the group of insight and maybe questions which they have, but think that they have too many questions and they've asked too many questions. Everybody should have questions or comments. Either you've read something in Spanish or in Japanese that interprets Benjamin, or in French, or German, or English, or something leaps out of the text. If not, we're going to start, well, even so, we'll start with number 4. And see how far we get.
I
See,
would like
close
to-
reading, you don't get anywhere. Yeah.
I would like to recommend to people who would like to see a living example of the death instinct or drive, to see Frederick Wiseman's most recent documentary called Monrovia, Indiana.
Oh, really?
It's playing at the Film Forum, and it's extraordinarily, beautifully horrifying. But,
Thank you, I
Is it in
didn't
theaters
know.
or is it available through Netflix?
No, it's
No,
in the theaters
it's
right
in
now.
the theaters
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now, yeah.
I didn't know about this
He's,
was.
Wow.
Wow.
I